The sea is a place of profound, unknowable secrets. It gives life and it takes life, often without reason or rhyme. We cast our nets upon its surface, trusting in its bounty, believing we understand its rhythms. But what if the depths hold a darkness far greater than any storm? What if the nets we cast for sustenance begin to pull up the evidence of our own deepest depravity? The story you are about to hear is set in a small, isolated fishing village, a place that thought its greatest struggles were with the wind and the tide. They were wrong. Their greatest struggle was with a monster hiding among them, a monster who turned their lifeblood into a graveyard. Before we haul this grim catch onto the deck, if you are drawn to mysteries that dredge the darkest corners of the human soul, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss the shocking truth we're about to expose. Now, let us take you to the wind-battered coast, to a place called Port Solitude. Port Solitude was a town clinging to the edge of the world by its fingernails. It was a rugged slash of coastline where the pine-choked forest met the cold, gray churn of the northern Atlantic, a place where the wind carried the perpetual scent of salt, diesel, and the deep, cold smell of the sea's harvest. The houses were stout, salt-bleached things, huddled together against the gales as if for warmth, their windows staring out at the unforgiving horizon like weary, watchful eyes. Life here was not a gentle rhythm. It was a constant, grueling battle against the elements, a battle waged by generations of grim-faced men and women whose hands were as tough and calloused as the barnacles on the pier. Detective Eva Rostova was a stranger in this land of ghosts and salt spray. She had come to Port Solitude 6 months ago, a self-imposed exile from the concrete canyons and chaotic violence of the city. A high-stakes undercover case had imploded, leaving her with a shattered knee, a shattered nerve, and a partner in the ground. The department had offered her a desk job, a quiet pity post until her retirement. She had refused. Instead, she had taken the one job no one else wanted, chief of police in the most remote, forgotten coastal town in the state. Here, the crime log consisted of bar fights, poaching disputes, and the occasional domestic disturbance. It was supposed to be a place to heal, place of quiet. The quiet ended on a Tuesday morning, under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The call came over the radio, a panicked, garbled scream from the captain of the Sea Serpent, one of the town's oldest and rustiest fishing trawlers. "Get down to the docks. Oh God, you gotta get down here. What we pulled up. It ain't right. It ain't fish." Eva met the Sea Serpent as it limped into the harbor, its engines sputtering. A small crowd of other fishermen had already gathered on the pier, their faces pale, their usual gruff banter replaced by a stunned, fearful silence. The winch on the trawler was groaning under a heavy load, but it wasn't a net full of shimmering cod or haddock. It was a tangled, grotesque mass of old netting, seaweed, and something else, something pale and horrifyingly familiar. As the net was hoisted over the deck, the full, unspeakable nature of the haul was revealed. It was a net of bodies, or more accurately, what was left of them. Skeletons, mostly, picked clean by the crabs and the cold, relentless water, their bones tangled in the tough, green nylon of the derelict ghost net they had been snagged in. There were at least a dozen of them, a chaotic, macabre jumble of human remains. We were dredging the old canyon, about 5 miles out. The captain, a grizzled old man named Silas, stammered, his face the color of wet ash. "Trying for halibut. Snagged this ghost net. Thought we'd torn the winch off the damn boat. The weight of it." Eva boarded the trawler, her bad knee protesting as she stepped onto the slick, bloody deck. The stench of decay, even after years in the cold water, was a tangible, foul presence. She was a homicide detective. She had seen death in all its brutal, ugly forms. But this was different. This was not a crime scene. This was an underwater tomb, accidentally dredged up from the depths. Her deputy, a young, green local named Ben, looked like he was about to be sick. "An old shipwreck, maybe?" he offered, his voice a hopeful whisper. "A fishing boat that went down years ago?" Eva shook her head, her eyes scanning the tangled remains. "No," she said, her voice low and tight. Look at the bones. The way they're scattered. This wasn't a single event. And look here. She pointed with a gloved finger to a single, pale femur. Scratched deep into the bone was a strange, intricate symbol, a spiral with 3 jagged lines radiating from it, like a stylized, angry sun. Shipwrecks don't do that. The arrival of the state forensics team turned Port Solitude into a media circus. The town's isolation, once its defining characteristic, was shattered by the arrival of news vans and gawking reporters. The bodies were carefully, painstakingly untangled and laid out in a refrigerated truck that had been brought in to serve as a temporary morgue. The initial count was staggering. 16 individuals. The forensic anthropologist who flew in confirmed Eva's initial assessment. The remains were of varying ages, some having been in the water for maybe a year, others for 5, maybe even 10. This was not a single massacre. This was a dumping ground. A serial killer's private graveyard. The investigation began, and Eva immediately slammed into the wall that had defined Port Solitude for centuries. The silence. The people of the town, who had been initially shocked and horrified, now became sullen, withdrawn, and deeply suspicious of her and the other outsiders. The fishermen, who knew the currents and the secrets of the coastline better than any map, suddenly had nothing to say. Their answers were clipped, their eyes evasive. The sea keeps its own counsel, was the common, frustrating refrain. She was met with the most resistance from the town's unofficial patriarch, a man named Elias Thorne. Thorne was the owner of the fish processing plant that was the town's only real employer. He was a man in his 60s, handsome in a rugged, weathered way, with eyes as cold and gray as the Atlantic. His family had founded Port Solitude, and he ruled it with a quiet, unquestioned authority that far surpassed that of the mayor or the town council. "A tragedy, detective?" Thorne had said to her in his cavernous, wood-paneled office, the smell of old money and power hanging in the air. "No doubt. These waters can be treacherous. We've lost many good men to them over the years. But these are not our people. They are outsiders. Drifters, likely. Who knows how they ended up in our waters?" His tone was one of polite dismissal, a clear message that this was not a Port Solitude problem. This was a problem that had washed up on their shores, and they wanted it and her to go away. The first few days of the investigation yielded little. The victims were, as Thorne had suggested, outsiders. Using dental records and the few scraps of clothing that had survived, the forensics team began to identify them. A runaway from Oregon, a backpacker from Canada, a young woman who had been working a seasonal job at a cannery 100 miles down the coast. They were all people from the margins, people whose disappearances had barely registered, their cold cases filed away in distant, understaffed police departments. A clear pattern was emerging. The killer had chosen his victims with a predator's cunning, selecting those who would not be easily missed. But it was the symbol, the strange, spiral sun carved into their bones, that haunted Eva. It was a mark of ownership, a signature. It was the one unifying thread in the chaotic tapestry of death. She searched historical archives, databases of gang symbols, and occult websites. Nothing. It was a language only the killer and his victims understood. As the first week of the investigation drew to a close, Eva felt a profound sense of isolation. She was an outsider trying to solve an outsider's murder in a town that wanted nothing to do with either. The entire community seemed to be locked in a conspiracy of silence. She would sit in her small, sterile apartment at night, her knee aching, the images of the bone-white bodies from the net replaying in her mind, and she would feel the same cold, creeping despair she had felt after her partner's death. She had come to Port Solitude to escape the ghosts, but she had found a town that was drowning in them. The massacre was exposed, but the murderers, she was beginning to suspect, were not a single person. The monster was not an individual. The monster was Port Solitude itself. The investigation into the Port Solitude Boneyard, as the media had grimly dubbed it, quickly became a bureaucratic and logistical nightmare. The sheer number of victims, the varying states of decomposition, and the lack of any local connection turned the case into a vast, unwieldy puzzle with 1,000 scattered pieces. The state police, after their initial high-profile involvement, began to lose interest, reallocating resources to more pressing, more solvable cases. The responsibility for the investigation fell squarely back onto the shoulders of Eva Rostova, the outsider chief of a one-man department, a woman tasked with solving a decade's worth of serial murder with a non-existent budget and a town full of hostile, silent witnesses. The silence was the most challenging part. It was a thick, oppressive fog, as real and as chilling as the mists that rolled in off the Atlantic every evening. Eva would walk the town's single, windswept street, and the conversations would stop. The gazes that followed her were not curious. They were cold, appraising, and deeply resentful. She was the one who had pulled their town's dark secret into the light, and they would never forgive her for it. The fishermen on the docks would mend their nets with a sullen, focused intensity, ignoring her questions. The women in the small general store would serve her in a clipped, stony silence. She was a pariah. She knew that to break the case, she had to break the silence. She needed an ally, a crack in the town's unified facade. She found her potential crack in the most unlikely of places. The town drunk. His name was Finn, a man in his late 50s with a face like a crumpled nautical chart and eyes that held the deep, haunted look of a man who had seen too much. He had once been the best fisherman in Port Solitude, they said, before a tragic accident at sea had taken his son and his will to live, leaving him with only a bottle for a companion. Eva would find him at the end of the pier every evening, a solitary figure staring out at the gray, churning water, a cheap bottle of whiskey in his hand. She started to approach him not as a cop, but as another lonely soul. She wouldn't ask him questions about the case. She would just sit on the cold, damp pier a few feet away from him, sharing the silence. She brought him a hot cup of coffee one evening. He had just grunted, but he had taken it. "They're afraid, you know," he finally said one night, his voice a rusty and used thing. His gaze was fixed on the horizon. "Not of you, of him." "Him who, Finn?" Eva asked gently. Finn took a long pull from his bottle. "Thorn," he slurred. "Elias Thorn. This town. It ain't a town. It's a kingdom. And he's the king. His family has owned the water, the boats, the plant, for 100 years. You don't cross the king." "What does Thorn have to be afraid of?" Eva asked. Finn just shook his head, a bitter, broken laugh escaping his lips. "The sea gives," he whispered, his voice full of a strange, drunken poetry. "And the sea takes. Thorn just makes sure it takes the right people. He keeps the balance." That's what they believe. It was a cryptic, maddening clue, but it was the first real piece of information she had gotten from a local. Thorn was not just a powerful man. He was the keeper of a balance. It sounded like the justification of a cult leader. Eva redoubled her investigation into Elias Thorn. She dug into his family history, his business dealings, the very foundations of his power. The Thorn family was Port Solitude. They had built the cannery, they owned the majority of the fishing fleet, and through a series of shell corporations, they owned most of the property in the town itself. The people of Port Solitude were not just his employees. They were his tenants. His control was absolute. She also discovered the story of Thorn's own personal tragedy. 20 years ago, his only daughter, a beautiful, rebellious girl of 17, had drowned. It had been ruled an accident. She had taken a small boat out during a storm. But Eva, reading the old case file, found it strange. The girl's body had been found with the same strange, spiral sun symbol carved into her arm. At the time, the local coroner, a man long since dead, had dismissed it as a post-mortem injury from a boat propeller. Eva now knew that was a lie. The girl's death had not been an accident. It had been a message or a part of the same horrific ritual. And it seemed to be the event that had solidified Thorn's cold, iron grip on the town. While she was digging into the past, the present was still unfolding. The forensics lab finally came back with a report on the victims. They had all died from the same cause, a single, precise stab wound to the base of the skull, a method that would cause instant death and paralysis. But they had also found something else. Trace amounts of a rare, powerful marine neurotoxin, found in a specific type of local shellfish, were present in the bone marrow of every victim. They had been drugged, incapacitated before they were killed. This was not a crime of passion. This was a methodical, organized, and almost scientific process of execution. Armed with this new knowledge, Eva decided to take a direct run at the Wall of Silence. She arrested one of the fishermen from the Sea Serpent, the one who had seemed the most nervous, on a trumped-up poaching charge. She let him sit in a cold cell for a day, letting the fear and isolation work on him. Then she went in to talk to him. "I'm not interested in the illegal lobster pots, Daniel," she said, her voice low and even. "I'm interested in the symbol, the one carved on the bones, the one that was carved on Elias Thorne's daughter." The man's face went white. The mention of Thorne's daughter was a taboo, a ghost that no one in the town ever spoke of. "That was an accident," he stammered. "Was it?" Eva pressed, leaning in. "Or was it the first offering? The first payment to what Finn calls the balance?" The man broke. A torrent of terrified, half-coherent words came pouring out. He spoke of a covenant, an old tradition. He said the sea was a living thing, a hungry god, and that when the catches were poor, when the town was on the brink of economic collapse, a tithe had to be paid. A sacrifice had to be made to appease the hunger of the deep. He claimed he knew nothing about the specifics, that it was a duty handled by a select few, the Tide Watchers, led by Thorne himself. They were the ones who kept the balance. They were the ones who chose the sacrifices outsiders, drifters, those whose absence would not disturb the town's delicate ecosystem. "It was for the good of the town," he sobbed, "to keep us all from starving. Thorne, he told us it was the only way." It was a confession to a conspiracy so monstrous, so steeped in a twisted, paganistic folklore, that it was almost unbelievable. The massacre was not the work of a single killer. It was a town's desperate, horrific tradition. They were sacrificing human beings to the ocean in exchange for fish. As Eva walked out of the interrogation room, the pieces of the puzzle crashing into place in her mind, she felt a profound, sickening chill. This was not a crime she could solve with a simple arrest. She was facing a deeply ingrained, communal madness. And she now understood that Elias Thorne was not just a king. He was a high priest, and the tide of whispers she had been following was leading her directly to the altar of his dark, bloodthirsty god. The fisherman's confession, as terrifying as it was legally useless. It was the coerced, panicked rambling of a man who would recant the second a lawyer entered the room. Eva had the horrific, ritualistic sacrifice to a sea god, but she still had no concrete proof, no direct evidence that would link Elias Thorne to a single murder. She had a motive, a mythology, but she didn't have the weapon or the crime scene. She knew the only way to catch Thorne was to catch him in the act. Her chance, she realized, was coming. The fisherman had spoken of the tithe being paid when the town was in need, and Port Solitude was in desperate need. The media circus surrounding the discovery of the bodies had been a death blow to their already struggling fishing industry. The price of their catch had plummeted, with distributors not wanting to be associated with the Cannibal Coast, as some outlets were calling it. The town was on the brink of economic collapse. The sea god, according to their twisted logic, would be hungry, and the perfect opportunity for a sacrifice was on the horizon, the annual blessing of the fleet. It was Port Solitude's most sacred and important tradition, a day-long festival where the entire town gathered at the docks. A priest from the next county over would come and bless the fishing boats, asking for a safe and prosperous season. It was a day of feasting, of drinking, of a forced communal optimism. Eva now saw it for what it really was, a pagan ritual thinly veiled in Christian tradition. It was the perfect cover for a human sacrifice. She began to prepare, turning her small office into a war room. She knew she was running out of time. She also knew that the cult, the Tide Watchers, would need a new victim. Her eyes were everywhere. She watched the bus stop, the small diner, the single grimy motel, looking for any new face, any potential unburdened soul who might wander into their web. She found her on a Thursday, 3 days before the blessing. She was a young woman, a backpacker, with bright, curious eyes, and the easy, open trust of someone who had not yet learned to fear the world. Her name was Maya. Eva struck up a casual conversation with her at the diner. She was hiking the coastline, she said, and had heard that Port Solitude was a place of rugged, untouched beauty. Eva's blood ran cold. The town's grim reputation had not yet reached the off-the-grid community of coastal hikers. To Maya, this place was not a graveyard. It was an adventure. Eva tried to warn her subtly at first. "It's not a very friendly town for tourists right now," she said. "There's been some trouble." But Maya just smiled, undeterred. "I'll be fine," she said. "I'm just passing through." Eva knew then that Thorn and his Tide Watchers had found their tithe. She now had a face, a name, a potential victim she had to protect. The case was no longer about the 16 dead bodies in the past. It was about the one living soul in the present. She began to shadow Maya, a secret, desperate guardian angel. She watched as the town's insidious hospitality began to wrap its tendrils around the unsuspecting girl. The owner of the general store gave her free supplies. A fisherman's wife offered her a room for the night, saving her the cost of the motel. Elias Thorn himself even stopped her on the street, welcoming her to his town with his charismatic, reptilian smile, and inviting her to be the town's special guest at the blessing of the fleet. It was a grooming, a gentle, friendly fattening of the lamb before the slaughter. Eva knew she had to find their sacred space, their abattoir, the place where the ritual was performed. The fisherman she had interrogated had been too terrified to tell her, but he had given her a clue. He had spoken of the Thorn Deeps, a name that meant nothing to her. She pored over old nautical charts of the area, and she found it. It was not a place on land. It was a place in the sea. A deep, treacherous sea cave on a remote, rocky island just off the coast, an island that was owned by the Thorn family. The charts noted that the cave was only accessible at low tide, and that it was known for its strange, resonant acoustics and a rare, bioluminescent algae that grew on its walls. It was a natural cathedral, a perfect place for a sacrifice. The night before the blessing of the fleet, Maya disappeared. Eva had been watching the house where she was staying, but they had been too clever. A diver's Iona faked fire alarm at the other end of town had pulled her away for less than 30 minutes. When she returned, Maya was gone. Eva knew she had no time to wait, no time to call for a backup that was hours away. She took the department's small, aging patrol boat and set out into the cold, black water, her destination the Thorn family's private island. The sea was rough, the wind a low, mournful howl. As she approached the island, a jagged black tooth against the stormy sky, she saw a faint, pulsing blue-green light emanating from a fissure in the cliffs at the waterline, the entrance to the Thorn Deeps. She anchored her boat and swam the last 100 yards in the frigid, churning water, her bad knee a hot, screaming agony. She pulled herself onto the rocks, her body trembling with cold and adrenaline, and slipped into the cave. The sight that met her was something out of a primeval nightmare. The cave was a vast, domed grotto, its walls shimmering with the ethereal blue-green light of the algae. The air was thick with the smell of brine, and something else, a coppery, metallic scent. In the center of the grotto was a large, flat rock, stained dark with old blood. An altar. Maya was there, tied to the altar, her eyes wide with a terror that was beyond screaming. And surrounding her were the Tide Watchers. At least a dozen of them, their faces hidden by the hoods of dark, oilskin cloaks. At the head of the altar, holding a long, obsidian knife that seemed to drink the light, was the high priest himself, Elias Thorn. He was chanting, his voice a low, resonant drone that was amplified by the cave's acoustics, a language that was ancient and guttural. He was not speaking to his followers. He was speaking to the sea. We offer this tithe, this unburdened soul to the hungry deep. Thorn's voice echoed around the shimmering walls. Take her, and grant us your bounty. Take this life, and grant us ours. He raised the knife. Eva stepped out of the shadows, her gun raised, her voice a sharp, clear crack in the ritualistic drone. It's over, Thorn. The chanting stopped. The hooded figures turned as one, their faces shocked in the eerie, blue light. Thorn looked at her, and his expression was not one of fear or of anger. It was one of profound, paternal disappointment. "You do not understand, detective," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. "This is not murder. This is salvation. This is the price of our survival. A price that must be paid." "The price is too high," Eva said, her gun steady on his chest. Thorn just smiled, a sad, chilling smile. "The sea will have her due," he whispered, "one way or another." And he lunged, not at Eva, but at the bound and helpless girl on the altar. The moment Thorn lunged was the moment the ancient, ritualistic calm of the sea cave shattered into brutal, modern violence. Eva fired her weapon, the sound a flat, deafening crack that was alien in the sacred, resonant space. The shot was not aimed to kill, but to disarm. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Thorn's shoulder, causing the obsidian knife to spin from his grasp and clatter onto the stone floor. He roared, a sound of pure, primal rage, less a man and more a wounded animal. The spell was broken. The Tide Watchers, who had been frozen in a state of religious reverence, were now just a dozen angry, frightened men, their hoods falling back to reveal the familiar, weathered faces of Port Solitude's most respected fishermen. They were not demonic cultists. They were her neighbors, and they were coming for her. The fight was a desperate, chaotic scramble for survival. Eva was outnumbered, outmatched, her bad knee a screaming liability on the slick, uneven floor of the grotto. She kicked the obsidian knife away, sending it skittering into a dark, water-filled crevice before the first of the fishermen reached her. He was a large, powerful man, and he swung a heavy, gaffing hook at her head. She ducked under it, the hook whistling past her ear, and used her momentum to drive her shoulder into his midsection, sending them both sprawling to the ground. She came up, her gun back in her hand, but she was in an impossible position. She couldn't shoot them all. These were not faceless thugs. They were the husbands and fathers of the town she was sworn to protect. They were murderers, yes, but they were also victims of a generational madness. As two more men closed in on her, a new sound echoed from the mouth of the cave. It was the roar of a powerful boat engine, and then a series of shouts. A blindingly bright searchlight flooded the grotto, momentarily dazzling everyone. "State police, drop your weapons!" A voice boomed through a megaphone. For a heart-stopping moment, everyone froze. Then Eva saw him, standing on the prow of a large, state police patrol boat that was now nosing its way into the cave's entrance, was Finn, the town drunk, his face grim and resolute in the harsh glare of the light. He had done it. The broken, silent man had found his voice and his courage. He had gone for help. The sight of the heavily armed state troopers pouring into the cave was the final, definitive end of the Tide Watchers' reign. The fishermen, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror at their own exposure, dropped their makeshift weapons and raised their hands. The ancient covenant was broken by the mundane, undeniable authority of the law. Elias Thorn, however, was not surrendering. He clutched his wounded shoulder, his eyes wild with a fanatic's fury. He looked at the police, at his captured followers, at the weeping, terrified girl on the altar, and he saw his life's work, his sacred duty, his entire world, turning to ash. He let out a final, guttural cry of defiance and turned, not to fight, but to flee. He scrambled towards the back of the cave, towards a dark, narrow fissure in the rock from which the sound of the churning sea could be heard. It was a sea spout, a blowhole that connected to the open ocean. "He's getting away!" one of the troopers shouted. Eva didn't hesitate. She pushed past the surrendering fisherman, her knee screaming in protest, and pursued him. She followed him into the tight, claustrophobic tunnel, the roar of the sea growing louder. She emerged onto a small, precarious ledge on the outside of the cliff, the storm-tossed Atlantic churning violently just a few feet below. Thorn was standing at the very edge of the ledge, his back to the abyss. He was no longer the powerful patriarch. He was just a man, his clothes soaked in blood, his face a mask of utter desolation. "You've destroyed us," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper against the roar of the wind and waves. "You have silenced the old gods. The sea will not be fed, and now it will starve us all. You did this," Eva shouted back over the storm. "You poisoned your own town with your superstitions, with your murders. You are not a priest. You are just a killer." Thorn looked down at the churning, black water, a strange, serene smile spreading across his face. "The sea gives," he said, his voice now calm, almost peaceful. "And the sea takes." And with that, he simply stepped backwards, off the ledge, and disappeared into the violent, unforgiving embrace of the water. He was swallowed by the waves, his body dragged down into the cold, dark depths he had revered and fed for so long. The sea, in the end, had claimed its final tithe. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of official procedure. The tide watchers were arrested, their silence finally broken, their horrifying, generational secret laid bare for the world to see. Maya, the backpacker, was rescued, physically unharmed but psychologically scarred forever. The town of Port Solitude was placed under a media microscope, its name becoming a byword for a kind of dark folk horror depravity. Eva Rostova was a hero. Her picture was on the front page of every newspaper, the lone, crusading cop who had exposed a murderous cult. But as she stood on the docks a week later, watching the state police divers search fruitlessly for Thorn's body, she felt no sense of victory. She looked at the faces of the women and children of the town, the families of the men she had arrested. She saw not gratitude, but a profound, bottomless despair. She had not just arrested their husbands and fathers. She had arrested their way of life, their history, their very identity. She had solved the massacre, but in doing so, she had been forced to perform a kind of social surgery, cutting out a cancer that was so deeply intertwined with the town's heart that she may have killed the patient in the process. The reckoning tide had come, and it had washed away the monsters, but it had also washed away the town's soul, leaving a clean, sterile, and desolate shore in its wake. The tide of reckoning that swept through Port Solitude left a permanent scar. The trials of the tide watchers were a grim, protracted affair, a public exorcism of the town's dark soul. The fishermen, stripped of their charismatic leader and the intoxicating power of their secret society, were just broken, middle-aged men, their confessions a sad litany of inherited madness and economic desperation. They were all found guilty and sent to prison, their sentences a final, legalistic end to a tradition that had been passed down through blood and whispers for generations. The town itself became a living ghost. The national media eventually moved on, but the stain remained. The fishing industry, once the town's lifeblood, collapsed completely. No one wanted to buy the catch from a place so profoundly associated with ritualistic murder. The cannery, the engine of the Thorn family's century-long reign, shuttered its doors, its machinery falling silent for the first time since it was built. Families packed up and left, unable to live with the ghosts and the shame. The houses that had once been filled with the boisterous energy of fishermen's families now stood empty, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at a sea that had once been their provider and was now their curse. Port Solitude was dying, not from a lack of fish, but from a surplus of truth. Eva Rostova stayed. She had been offered promotions, transfers back to the city, a hero's welcome. She had refused them all. She felt a profound, unshakable sense of responsibility for the broken community she had exposed. She had not created the cancer, but she had been the one to wield the scalpel, and the surgery had left the patient in a permanent, comatose state. Her quiet, healing exile had become a lifelong penance. Her job as chief of police was now a strange, melancholy role. She was the guardian of a graveyard. Her days were spent not investigating crimes, but dealing with the slow, sad process of a town's decay, mediating property disputes for abandoned homes, dealing with the occasional squatter, and filing the endless paperwork that documented the town's slow slide into oblivion. The silence she had once sought had returned, but it was no longer the peaceful quiet of a forgotten town. It was the heavy, profound silence of a place that had lost its reason to speak. She would often find herself down at the docks, watching the few remaining, Independent fishermen cast their lines for a meager catch, their faces etched with a permanent, weary sorrow. She became a keeper of the victims' stories. She worked with the families of the 16 people found in the net, helping them navigate the legal system, providing them with the details of their loved ones' final days. She was the only one who could give them answers, and in doing so, she absorbed a piece of their grief. The ghosts she had come to Port Solitude to escape had been replaced by 16 new ones, their faces and stories now a permanent part of her own. Finn, the man whose courage had been the turning point, became her only real friend. He never touched another drop of alcohol after that night. The exorcism of the town's demons had, in a way, been his own. He and Eva would often sit on the pier, just as they had in the beginning, sharing a thermos of coffee, watching the tide roll in. They rarely spoke of the past. They didn't have to. It was there, in the silence between them, in the gray, restless water that stretched out to the horizon. One evening, years after the trials, Finn turned to her, his gaze fixed on the water. "Do you think he was right?" he asked, his voice a low, rough whisper. "Thorn, do you think the sea is angry now? That we broke some kind of promise?" The fishing had never recovered. The waters around Port Solitude, once teeming with life, had become strangely barren. Marine biologists had offered a dozen scientific explanations over fishing, changing currents, climate change. But for the people who remained, there was only one explanation. The tithe had not been paid. "No, Finn," Eva said, her voice firm. "Thorn was a murderer who used a folk tale to justify his own monstrosity. The sea doesn't have a mind. It doesn't make bargains." But as she looked out at the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean, at the deep, unknowable darkness beneath the surface, she couldn't completely shake the feeling that she was wrong. She had brought the laws of man to a place that had, for centuries, lived by a different, more ancient set of rules. She had brought light into the darkness, but in doing so, she had revealed a horror so profound that the darkness seemed, in some ways, more merciful. The massacre was over, the case was closed, and the guilty were punished. But the mystery of Port Solitude, the deep, unsettling question of what the sea truly demands of those who live by it, remained. The town was now quiet, the nets empty, the houses dark. The silence was absolute. But for Eva, and for all who remained, it was a silence that was filled with the faint, persistent, and eternal sound of the unquiet deep.